following is based on true events.
Please stay tuned until after the show for some podcast updates. Tonight's special report is titled Complete Control. Let's begin. Around 18 months ago, we produced a specially researched report into the little reported but multiple facets of the hidden Brexit truths in the United Kingdom. At the time, many media outlets, researchers, political commentators, journalists and politicians were weighing in and talking about Brexit, not just in the UK, but throughout Europe and the wider world community. But none were openly discussing the topics that we wanted to discuss and uncover. A culture of disaster capitalism was sweeping through the UK, and those in power and influence were caught in the rapids, and we called it out and brought it into the light. With the burning fire of Canadian activist and journalist Naomi Klein on the tip of our tongues and at the forefront of our impatience, we pushed forward to reveal the great Brexit taboo, the taboo that had become the reality of post-Brexit UK over the last year. Our rigour landed me on mainstream media in the UK and Germany, talking about my research and claims. It caused a tsunami of new listeners to come to our podcast and listen to what we had to say. It resulted in our most downloaded episode ever, The Great Brexit Lie. Well, here we go again. So we are back with a special report that we have spent a number of months researching in order to present you with facts and data regarding something that hasn't fully played out yet, and something we are curious and suspicious to see in which direction its waters will flow. It's a subject that came from a single conversation that I had with a colleague back in March. It's something that is talked about by everyone, everywhere, yet there are elements within the subject that are very taboo, yet hugely important to us all. In bringing you this episode, we are also fighting censorship and control, so this episode might not sit in the public domain for very long, so we will distribute it everywhere that we possibly for as long as we can. SARS-CoV-2, or Severe Acute Respiratory Syndrome Coronavirus 2, known commonly as COVID-19, has not left the news since it emerged in December 2019. The world has been grabbed in a desperate state of pandemic now for 22 months, something we don't have to tell you or anyone on the planet about. Wait, let me backtrack just 1 second. Before we proceed any further, I would like to clarify a number of things with you so that we know where we are heading. There are 5 contributors currently that make up the Dead Soul Social Club team. All 5 of us are fully double vaccinated with either the Oxford AstraZeneca, Pfizer or Moderna COVID vaccines, or a combination of the 2 of the vaccines. We personally fully support getting vaccinated. We have all read the research and data provided by medical experts and are confident in our personal decisions. Further, we respect the right and opinion of those who choose not to get vaccinated. It's a decision each individual must make for themselves, and it is not our interest or agenda to push any opinion for or against in regards to any of the available vaccination options. Yes, all of us at Dead Souls have our own independent opinions regarding the vaccinations. Absolutely we do. But this episode and our platform is not the place where we will be sharing those or for attempting to push any specific agenda for or against. Our aim here, as always, is to share science, data and research that can be corroborated and substantiated by those qualified and educated in their relevant specialist fields. We will reference our sources and the evidence we have found to allow each of you to make up your own educated decisions. We want to clarify this just to ensure that we aren't drawn into any anti or pro-vax debate. We have no interest in having those conversations with anyone. Thank you. But this report is not about the vaccination anyway. Not at all. Not even a little bit. This report is about the origins of the virus and what the virus means for our future and freedom. I bet it's something you haven't given much thought to really, and why would you? But, saying that, you are all likely familiar with the story of the virus origins. This is an excerpt taken from Wikipedia. Whilst I appreciate Wikipedia is not a reliable source, in this instance it does perpetuate the given official narrative of the origins of the virus in its standard and most reliable format, a format that is supported by media outlets across the globe. The excerpt reads in part, "The virus is thought to be natural and of animal origin through spillover infection. There are several theories about the first case, the so-called Patient Zero, which originated, and investigations into the origin of the pandemic are ongoing. Phylogenetics estimates that SARS-CoV-2 arose in October or November 2019. A phylogenetic algorithm analysis suggested that the virus may have been circulating in Guangdong before Wuhan. Although one Italian study suggests it was present there as early as September 2019, evidence suggests that it descends from a coronavirus that infects wild bats and spread to humans through an intermediary wildlife host. The possibility that the virus was accidentally released from a laboratory is also under increasingly active consideration." So, did the virus occur in nature, or did it emerge accidentally from a laboratory? Why is this subject such a contentious point? And is there a deliberate attempt to obscure the facts of the origins of the coronavirus? Should we actually trust the accepted reporting around this issue? Sky News under Andrew Bolt for the Bolt Report in Australia reported in May 2021 that it is absolutely accurate that the intelligence community does not know exactly where, when or how the COVID-19 virus was transmitted initially, but we're continuing to work on this issue and collect information. The report continued that it had been evidence that security and safety precautions in the Wuhan Institute of Virology was significantly lacking. I'm going to refer to an article next which was written by Nicholas Wade in May 2021. For those unaware, Wade is a science investigative journalist editor and an author who has worked on the staff of Nature, Science and for many years the New York Times. He is a very credible expert with many years experience, though that doesn't stop him having his critics, Dr. Anthony Fauci being one of them. Interestingly, however, the CIA and Department of Defense actually consider him credible and reliable. So let's clarify what Nicholas Wade is asserting. In Wade's own words, the Chinese virologists are doing the same as virologists all over the world. They were doing a very dangerous category of experiments called gain of function. That's where you soup up a natural animal virus to try and see what sort of tweaks it might need to learn to become a human pathogen. And the rationale for this is, well, if we can get a few steps ahead of nature, then that will help us prevent the next pandemic. Wade went on, Chinese authorities reported that many cases of COVID-19 occurred in the wet market in Wuhan, which reminded experts of the SARS-1 epidemic in 2002, in which a bat virus at first had spread to civets, an animal similar to a mongoose, sold in wet markets, and from there the civets then transmitted to humans. A similar virus and situation actually caused the second epidemic known as MERS in 2012. According to Wade's article, which can be read on thebulletin.org, the wet market connection was soon lost when Chinese researchers found earlier cases in Wuhan which had no links at all to the wet market. This, however, didn't change the media's natural emergence story though, for some reason. Now, like you, I think I heard fairly early on in the pandemic, likely in the second quarter of 2020, that Wuhan, the Chinese city at the heart of the virus outbreak, housed an institute where various viruses were studied by the Chinese government. But I also recall that various media outlets were very clear and specific that the virus did not come from the institute, and that it had occurred naturally from animals being sold at the wet market. In fact, it was almost taboo to suggest anything other than the official story that was substantiated by the World Health Organization at the time. The Huanan wet market, incidentally, is just short of 9 miles from the Wuhan Institute of Virology, a biosafety level 4 laboratory and one of the only kind in all of China. Biosafety level 4 are extremely high security and high safety level labs that study the most dangerous known pathogens known to man. Viruses such as Lassa and Ebola would be a typical study subjects there, for example. From early on, the public and media perceptions were shaped in favour of the natural emergence scenario by strong statements from two scientific groups. To quote, "We stand together to strongly condemn conspiracy theories suggesting that COVID-19 does not have a natural origin, a group of virologists and others wrote in The Lancet on February 19, 2020, when it was really far too soon for anyone to be sure what had happened exactly. Scientists overwhelmingly conclude that this coronavirus originated in wildlife, they said, with a stirring rallying call for leaders to stand with Chinese colleagues on the front line of fighting the disease. Why the insistence that the public believe a specific narrative so early on, before any research whatsoever had been done into its actual scientific origin? It doesn't make sense. To continue, the idea that the virus might have escaped from a lab-invoked accident surely needed to be explored, not rejected out of hand. In fact, the World Health Organization team that was sent to Wuhan to investigate the virus origins didn't actually arrive in Wuhan until February the 3rd, 2021, some 14 months after the reported start of the pandemic. A defining mark of good scientists is that they go to great pains to distinguish between what they know and what they don't know. By this criterion, the signatories of the Lancet letter were behaving as poor scientists. They were assuring the public of facts that they could not know for sure were in fact true. It later emerged that the Lancet letter had actually been organised and drafted by Peter Daszak, president of the EcoHealth Alliance of New York. Daszak's organisation actually funded corona research at the Wuhan Institute of Virology. So by that measure, if the SARS-2 virus had instead escaped from research that he funded, Daszak would be potentially culpable. A state of conflict of interest was not declared to the Lancet's readers. In fact, the letter actually concluded, and I quote, "We declare no competing interests." Surely the World Health Organization team that went to Wuhan in February 2021 must have uncovered further evidence regarding the origins of the virus though. What if I told you that a senior member of the team was none other than Peter Daszak? Indeed. I mentioned that there were two scientific groups which shaped the public perceptions of the virus origins though. Well, the second statement that had enormous influence in shaping the public attitude was a letter, and to be clear, an opinion piece, not a collection of scientific evidence at all. The opinion piece was published on the 17th of March 2020 in the scientific journal Nature Medicine. The letter's authors were a group of 5 virologists led by Christian G. Anderson of the Scripps Research Institute. They went on to say, "Our analysis clearly showed that SARS-CoV-2 is not a laboratory construct or a purposefully manipulated virus." This was a case of poor science, however. Whilst it is true that some older methods of cutting and pasting viral genomes retain telltale signs, shall we say, of manipulation, more current methods, which are called seamless approaches, leave no defining marks of manipulation. Nor do other methods of manipulating viruses, such as serial passage or the repeated transfer of viruses from one culture of cells to another. If a virus has been manipulated, whether with a seamless method or by serial passage, there is no way of knowing, no scientific way of knowing, that this is the case. Anderson and his colleagues were assuring their leaders of something they could not possibly know or prove. For me, I'm always keen to analyse the political leanings of any major story within the media. Each news outlet will put their own spin on a story that favours their political leaning for the most part. So I find it particularly interesting that the story of the virus origins seems to have been created by 2 sources of dubious intent and has not been challenged for the most part. I think I worry that the biggest area of inquiry and the matter of most noted interest is how this could potentially affect public attitudes towards science, even beyond the huge disciplines of virology and epidemiology. There could be tremendous blowback from the public if this virus turned out to have been created in a lab, not to mention the international political ramifications that could fall out from a global death rate of currently 4.5 million. Indeed, Nicholas Wade made further accusations based on his research into the COVID origins, namely the safety precautions of the Wuhan Institute of Virology. We have all seen the photographs on the internet of Dr. Shi Zhengli, the director of coronavirus research program at the Wuhan Institute of Virology. She is seen on Chinese government released photographs wearing BSL level 4 bubble suit, conducting her experiments in a manner of extreme safety. So it all looks like it was safe, but in fact all her experiments were done in a much lower level of safety, about the level required in the average dentist's office or BSL level 2, Wade asserts. You know, it's one thing to query sciences and model investigation, experimentation, studying facts, exploring new frontiers, but of course science and big pharma in particular exist with powerful economic interests and have alliances with significant powerful global figures with incredible influence on the global stage. So sometimes when you're questioning science, you may be directly questioning the opposing interests of some of the world's most powerful people. But it's key to identify what those people's interests are and why, to identify the reasons for actions being undertaken, either individually or by corporations. A headline in the Washington Post, in an article by Josh Rogan, says that a new US congressional report states that COVID-19 likely emerged in Wuhan months earlier than originally thought. The Chinese government continues to actively thwart a real investigation into the origins of COVID-19, Rogan goes on to say, and a new GOP congressional report alleges that Beijing was covering up the outbreak for months longer than previously assumed. The Washington Post article, dated August 2nd, 2021, went on to say that the House Foreign Affairs Committee, led by Republican Michael McCaul, released an 84-page addendum to their initial Origins of COVID-19 report on Monday 2nd of August that stated thus: "It is our belief the virus leaked sometime in late August or early September 2019. This was around 4 months before the official given narrative." McCaul also said, "When they realized what had happened, Chinese Communist Party officials and scientists at the Wuhan Institute of Virology began frantically covering up the leak. But the cover-up was too late. The virus was already spreading throughout the megacity of Wuhan." In March of 2020, China traced its first case back to November 17, 2019, citing the wet market origin story. But since then, more and more evidence has emerged that suggests that the virus was circulating in Wuhan well before that time. The committee's report notes, "The Wuhan Institute of Virology took its main public virus database offline on September the 12th, 2019. Dozens of athletes from several countries who attended the 2019 Military World Games in Wuhan in late October reported that they came down with COVID-like illnesses, either while they were in Wuhan or shortly after returning home." The committee report also references commercially available satellite imagery that shows significantly increased activity at the 6 Wuhan hospitals closed to the Wuhan Institute of Virology in September and October of 2019. The article then goes on to evidence the committee staff also unearthed an archived version of a contract competition for a new $128,000 security service procurement project that was issued by the Wuhan Institute of Virology on September the 12th, the same day that the virus database went mysteriously offline. 4 days later, the Wuhan Institute of Virology announced a new contract competition to completely renovate its air conditioning system for an estimated $606,000. Both contract announcements were later scrubbed from the Chinese Ministry of Finance website. It's all pretty damning evidence, isn't it? The US government and the Chinese government and powerful transnational bodies funded by the very institutions and organizations that they set up to regulate. It's indeed not a very transparent situation, and also reeks of deception and cover-up. But why does any of this matter? Well, it all comes back to the age-old story of whether you can trust your own government. The individuals that are in power because you put them there. You voted them into their positions as the best person for the job, so surely they must be honest with you, the people. I'm not naive though, and neither are you. We all know that this is a rose-tinted statement, and the truth and reality are far murkier than that, although it is a real shame that we have to accept that too. But let's look at this realistically, and I'll phrase this quite bluntly. Why are Western nations, who typically distrust the Chinese government, perpetuating and accepting the given origin and timeline of COVID-19 and not challenging it in any way? Knowing how Western nations work, What is it that they can gain by accepting the provided Chinese narrative? Because rest assured, if there was nothing to gain by accepting the provided story, then I'm sure that the deaths of 4.5 million people, of their citizens, might just be enough for the West to raise at least a polite issue with China. Well, when things get bad and situations become extreme, then the only resolution will be measures of equal extremity. We are talking once again about disaster capitalism. Because no matter where you are in the world right now, the reality of COVID passports are being discussed by those in positions of power. Big tech companies are being granted the right to develop databases in the United States, while in the UK, COVID passports are being discussed as a serious way of demonstrating whether or not you've had a COVID vaccine, thus giving you increased or diminished access to multiple public amenities depending on your level of vaccine. What do you think? Is it right that big tech companies and or the state are given the power to determine whether or not you can enjoy everyday freedoms? Is this a step towards ID cards by stealth, or maybe the further empowering of massive centralized authorities that we already have good reason to distrust? More and more global citizens are getting inoculated against COVID-19, and the idea of vaccine passports has emerged as a point of serious contention, particularly in the Western world where individuals are vocal and protective of their freedoms. Vaccine passports would be a form of identification to gain entry to certain businesses or cultural events that require patrons to be vaccinated. They may require vaccine passports for you to access public buildings or even your place of employment. The way that advances towards the vaccine passport are slightly different on opposite ends of the Atlantic Ocean are thus: in the United Kingdom, the infrastructure is almost already in place as the UK operates a national health service. As the UK's primary healthcare provider, it already is well established and digital. It wouldn't take great strides to incorporate a vaccine confirmation app to within that countrywide digital infrastructure. In the United States, a vaccination passport is something that will be mandated at state level, and with the US being a more corporatized nation, the rollout of the digital framework will go to multiple corporations, each of them being the lowest bidder for the passport franchise. American friends, how do you feel having your medical and personal history stored and kept by a national conglomerate who you might choose not to do business with at any other time? What else will they do with your data, for example? Vaccine passports will be pitched as something small and almost insignificant, a tiny tool that will be added to your smartphone that means you can return to ordinary life. It sounds quite appealing when you look at it like that, doesn't it? Well, I carry my smartphone everywhere I go anyway, so if I add this free app, that means, no more restrictions on my everyday life, so sign me up. But like everything else, you have to ask what's in it for them. It seems cynical though, doesn't it? But look at it like this. Why would a huge multinational corporation spend millions, maybe even billions, setting up the vaccine passport infrastructure to then give an app away free to use for the public? What does it gain from any of this? And with no national standards, states, companies and healthcare providers are now coming up with their own options and ideas. While overseas, many European countries and global airlines are pushing for their own type of vaccine passports, hoping to jumpstart tourism. Take Israel, for example. They are already using vaccine passports, giving those vaccinated access to hotels, gyms, music venues and cruises, with the Royal Caribbean having restored vaccine-only cruises from Israel as recently as last May. One of the most significant risks is that it will create a two-tier society. A society where those that have been vaccinated and can provide proof of it will have access to all manner of utilities and amenities that will be denied to people that either don't want to have a vaccine or can't afford a vaccine or indeed are superstitious of vaccines. It's essentially alienating those that don't conform, almost like a militant class system. Let's also realize, of course, that along with these issues also comes a number of social issues, economic issues, race and class issues, political issues even. These are all only highlighted by something like a national mandated passport. To look at it cynically, how is it any different to being asked for your papers in exchange for free movement in 1930s Nazi Germany, for example? Stephanie Hare, writing for The Guardian last April, said, "For months, ministers have been telling us that there no pre-plans for vaccine passports, while at the same time funding 8 different pilot schemes to test them. Hare continued, in January, the UK Health Secretary Matt Hancock stated, "We are not a papers-carrying country, yet here we are with the government reviewing plans to become just that." So I suppose that the authorities and institutions who are planning to move forward with these vaccine passport plans are the same authorities and institutions that have not behaved in any way that engender trust in us all, really. We have learned from whistleblowers like Julian Assange and Edward Snowden how government agencies behave when they have great power and data from the masses. So I suppose what I'm asking is, are we ready to allow those same authorities, those very same institutions that have been given greater access in the past and been given greater control over us and our everyday lives, are we indeed giving them the authority to have even more power yet again? Eventually we arrive at a place where the issue becomes not about the pandemic at all, but about trust and who we grant authority and power to, and how they use that authority over us. The UK Cabinet Office Minister Michael Gove stated in April that the British government is studying a Green Pass system that has been built in Israel. He continued that if the plan does require legislation, the government may try to win over the rebels by promising it'll only ever be temporary legislation, perhaps no more than a year. Let me play devil's advocate here for a moment. But surely a plan of this magnitude, such as a national vaccination passport rollout that will both allow and curb certain freedoms, surely that plan will almost certainly require legislation. It would be a legal minefield without it, thus driving at the inevitable question: when was the last time you heard a government state, these powers are only temporary, and then happily revoke those powers from their arsenal shortly after? Can anyone say US Patriot Act? This could be a pivotal moment for our generation in history. I've said before, and I'll say it again, disasters and times of crisis are used by those in authority to leverage even further power for the already powerful. We have come full circle again to disaster capitalism, and there are certain nations like the UK, United States, Canada, the European countries, and Australia, to name but a few, whose political bedrock sits atop an outlook where disaster capitalism has been their strongest theoretical ally for decades. As per Naomi Klein's shock doctrine, find a problem, provide a solution to that problem. That solution to that problem impedes the freedom of ordinary people. I won't scaremonger, but think for yourselves the outcomes and answers to these questions. If governments legally collected your data, which they could, how do they actually physically collect it, store it, and who has access to that information? What do those with access to the data actually do with it? There might be a narrow distinction between how this is playing out in the UK compared to the US, but the end point, if you want to enjoy an ordinary life, then the end point is that you are going to require ID, and how that ID ultimately ends up being used is out of your hands once the technology exists. And guess what? That technology already exists. Liberty, the human rights pressure group, have publicly stated, which I sourced from The Guardian, that vaccine passports could create a two-tier society where unvaccinated people overlap too closely for comfort with those who are already marginalized and discriminated against. Vaccine uptake is lower in black and minority ethnic communities, often with good historical reasons to distrust all authority figures. That's food for thought. But I would argue that food for thought extends to all of us, as in all of us have a right to query and question authority. Indeed, all of us know that governments and political parties regularly make pledges and then rescind them. Again, we all know just how much big tech companies behave in ways that are questionable. Bottom line, it's these people, these authorities and corporations that are going to be granted further power over you and your life and freedoms. When something attracts the interest of the powerful, it's almost impossible to stand in its way. Additionally, try to think of a time when a government or authority wished to carry out an act but decided not to on a legitimately moral standpoint. Once we've built a system that links our identity to our health data and we make this a condition of operating freely and living normally, what will stop additional pieces of data being added to that same digital passport? In a society that is now so heavily data-driven, where data is the ultimate power commodity, could this passport be the first step in all our data and information stored on a microchip accessible by those in power? Am I suggesting that there is some secret government organization who are nefariously plotting to control all of us and in turn rule the world? No, of course not. The real world doesn't work that way. But what I am saying is that if we are indifferent and allow step 1, then eventually step 2 happens, and step 3, and step 4, and so on. One leads to another like dominoes, and we must think hard and fast about whether we should allow this small infraction into our privacy, as when the longer infractions and removal of liberties occur, it may be too late to step up and do much about it. It's worth mentioning also that these vaccination apps are being pushed by technology companies. They're not something that's coming from public health experts, so we should absolutely be suspicious of their motives. It's payday for them, and more power for the authorities. Payday for the big tech companies also means far greater lobbying power, which means more money for government and more power for the corporations. Can you see how they both gain the same and the same way? How one hand washes the other? We seem to be going full steam ahead with something for which an outcome is unknown and shaky. We don't even know if vaccine passports would help to solve our biggest problem, stopping the spread of the virus. We don't know how long immunity will last. We don't know to what extent vaccines reduce transmission, or by how much, or whether this varies depending on which vaccine has been taken. We don't know how much a vaccine passport system will cost, or how we would know if it represents good value. We don't know whether our resources will be better invested in other solutions. Shouldn't we at least have some of these answers before putting all of our eggs in one basket? I'm just adding this bit after the initial recording has taken place. As I'm editing this episode, the Scottish Parliament in the United Kingdom has approved vaccine passports to enable residents of Scotland to access everyday public services and businesses. Something to think about. Anyway, thanks everyone. We'll see you next time. Be sure to check out our brand new website at www.deadsoulsocialclub.com. We now have a regular blog and newsletter so you can get even more updates on our work. Head over to our site and subscribe to our show and newsletter, the whole 9 yards. Also, we are back later this month in series format, so be sure to stay tuned for that too. There's more details on our new show structure in our blog, along with what we have been up to recently. So friends, be sure to sleep tight, and remember, stand firm as you enter the darkest night.